back. My name is Pieter Spígel. I'm the U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times. I'm here sharing the stage today with Klaaus Regling. We were just discussing before this, I think this is the third time we've shared the stage together at Delphi. Hopefully next year it will actually be in Delphi rather here in Athens. But it's very good to share the stage with you again. We're here discussing the future of the international role of the euro, something that Klaus has been working on, frankly, even before the ESM ever existed. So why don't I turn the microphone over to you and for some open remarks, and then I'll ask you a few questions about that topic. Klaus, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm also happy to be here. And we all look forward to Delphi next year. But thanks for organizing this. Yes, the euro. I'm old enough to remember times before the euro started. And I know that we had many crises. Europe's response to turmoil in financial markets was actually the move to euro, which was prepared for more than 30 years. There was the Werner Plan already developed in the 70s in response to the United States leaving the Bretton Woods system. And the risk was that there would be too much intra-European currency moves that would be bad for the single market. So the euro is actually a big achievement. We have had some problems, teething problems the last 20 years, big crisis, and who knows that better than the Greek population, but I think it is a big achievement. The euro, since its creation, is clearly the number 2 currency in the world, in the international monetary system. The US dollar is number 1, and there's a big difference, but the difference is getting smaller. The importance of the US dollar has been declining over the last 20 years. That's very clear. The IMF came out with a blog 2 weeks ago and said the share in foreign exchange reserves of the dollar has dropped by 12 percentage points since 1999 when the euro was created. The aim of the euro was never to replace the dollar. That's sometimes something I read in media, but it's wrong. That was never the intention. But I think as I see this shifts, the importance of the dollar slowly declining, the importance of the euro is clearly number 2 and stable. I think we are moving towards a new international monetary system, and I think that's good. I think it would be good for Europe, and in Europe it has become more of an issue now. We want to become more independent, don't want too much reliance on the dollar, partly because we don't like the extraterritorial sanctions that US governments impose from time to time, and using the financial system for that is easy because everybody uses the dollar. So that's one motivation for Europe to think more about it, but it would also be good, importantly, for the world economy, because I remember the big debt crisis of emerging markets, early 80s Latin America, late 90s in Asia, and they always had something to do with the US dollar, the over-reliance of emerging markets when they borrow in only one currency. So I think it's good for Europe. It would be good for the world economy if we move towards a multipolar system. And I think in Europe we know how to do it, but I'm sure you will ask about that.
Well, I want to talk a bit about the issue of extraterritoriality, because I think that has exacerbated by President Trump, the fact that the dollar was used sort of as a geopolitical tool. But before I get to that, let me just talk a bit about my favorite topic, which is the governance and structure of the euro. Because if you look at, again, the dollar, but not even the dollar, if you look at even the renminbi in terms of competitors to the dollar and reserve currencies, they do have some characteristics that the euro still does not have, right? We still do not have common debt issuance. Now, obviously, the ESM plays a role in that, in some ways the first institution to actually issue common debt. We obviously have the new COVID rescue plan, which is also common debt, but you don't have a treasury market with the depth and liquidity that you have in the US. In certain respects, you don't have a deep capital market like you do in New York. Obviously, the Capital Markets Union is an effort to create that. How much of sort of the lack of those other accoutrements, for lack of a better words, that the euro still lacks holds back the euro, do you think, as an international reserve currency? And do you see that actually changing over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
No, I think you're absolutely right. All the points you mentioned are a reason why there's a big difference between the dollar and the euro in the world economy. I mean, there are some ways to measure the importance of the euro where actually we are at the same level. In invoicing, for instance, payments, it's the same amount in dollar and in euro. But there are many other indicators where the euro is clearly number 2, with a big difference of 1 to 3. And the points you mentioned have something to do with that, but these are also the points we are working on. Clearly, the agenda, it's on the agenda to create a full banking union. We are not there yet. We have come a long way the last 10 years on banking union, but we know we should, for several reasons, complete that process. Same with capital markets union. We are not there yet. We know that. Many things need to be worked on, and it's technically complex. But it's clearly on the agenda. And this is not only because it would strengthen the international role of the euro, it would strengthen the European economy. That's the main driving force, of course. But then as a positive side effect, after it raises the growth potential in Europe, it also would make it more attractive for international investors, I think. And we need to develop the market infrastructure. Common debt issue, as you say, has increased significantly. It was never zero before the pandemic, as some people believe. We already had substantial amount of debt issued by the ESM, my institution, but also by the European Investment Bank and a little bit by the European Commission. When you add it up, it was already in 2019, there were 800 billion euro in bonds circulating from these 3 European institutions. With the response to COVID-19, if all the things that were decided are implemented, it could go up to 2 trillion. So quite a big jump. And on top of that, of course, we have AAA and AA rated sovereign debt from a number of countries. So it's not the same as one US Treasury bond market. It's the same issuer. We have several issuers, but we will have many more safe assets than we had before the pandemic. And that's one important element to make the euro more attractive.
Can I just challenge you a bit on this? Because I left Brussels, I think, 6 years ago. And capital markets union and full banking union and those were still on the agenda to be decided. Here we are 6 years later, and there's been very little progress. There's that famous Jean Monnet statement, which says the EU only moves forward through crises. Do you think that we can get to a full banking union, a full credit markets union without a crisis? Do you think there's any progress? I see very little political willingness to go in that direction.
Well, I would challenge that there's little progress because there was no banking union. We didn't even know that the word banking union in 2010. It appeared first in 2012. And people typically talk about 3 pillars of the banking union. And the first 2 pillars are there. We have a common supervisor, the SSM at the ECB, and that was a breakthrough. This is something that was already discussed during the Maastricht negotiations, and there was no consensus on that. And in 2012, it was decided to do it. So big progress. We have the Bank Resolution Board and Bank Resolution Fund. And now from next year, the ESM will provide a backstop to that. So that's the second pillar. So 2/3 is done. So I would think that is more than little progress. The third pillar is missing. So we know we are not there. The third pillar has important items like a common deposit insurance, better crisis management, how to deal with the sovereign exposure of banks. So difficult, also politically sensitive items, but it's 1/3 that's missing. And we are working on it. The Eurogroup discussed it in its last meeting 2 weeks ago. We are developing a work plan. It will take a few years. It will not be there next year. Similarly, on the capital markets union, the Commission has made proposals, several legislative proposals. Many of them have been implemented the last few years, but the more difficult ones not yet. So again, progress, but we are not there yet.
Fair enough.
But we know that this is important to work on because, again, good for the European economy, good for the international role of the euro.
Let me turn then now to this issue of extraterritoriality, because I don't think it started under President Trump. In many ways, it was Barack Obama who started using the dollar as a geopolitical tool on sanctions, on Iran, sort of using the threat of being disconnected from the dollar system as a tool for foreign policy. But clearly, under the 4 years of Trump, that became metastasized. I mean, he saw the dollar as a weapon. And in many ways, that increased support for an alternative to the euro.
Yeah.
Can I ask a bit about that? And to what extent do you think Trump, in many ways, was a helper to helping the euro become a bit more of a international reserve currency?
I think it certainly raised the awareness of many Europeans that there was a problem. And we know that Trump did not believe in multilateral approaches. And Europe, the European Union, is the ultimate believer in multilateral approaches. That's how we live, that's why we exist. So there was a big clash. So that certainly accelerated this move to be more aware. But as you say, it did not start. There was some of it before. And now I think it's on the agenda. The Euro Summit in March had it for the first time ever on the top of their agenda at a summit that was unprecedented. So now it's there. And there's another reason why I think in Europe we are now becoming more aware that we should do something and that it's important for us Europeans to act on this. It's that the Chinese renminbi is coming up. Until recently, that was not really seen as an issue or as something that was happening. But we do know that the Chinese government has made it a top policy priority to reduce the reliance on the dollar. And given that China will become the largest economy in the world over the next few years, that will provide the economic weight to do that. They know they have to do many other things. They have to open their capital markets. They will always have some problem in the foreseeable future that the credibility of the legal system at the moment only exists in Europe and the US, not in China. And that is a big minus for developing the role of the renminbi. But on the economic side, they have many pluses, and they have arranged many bilateral arrangements with neighboring countries in Asia to invoice trade already in renminbi. There is more and more debt issued in renminbi also by non-Chinese issuers. So I think China is coming from very, very low, much below the euro, but moving up very fast. And given that these will be the two big geopolitical and economic powers in the world, Europe would only be a third. So I think that's another reason we have to work on our agenda, which is well defined.
Well, this is what I was going to ask. Just try to tie the two issues together. Do you sense that the bad behavior, for lack of a better word, by the Trump administration and the rise of the renminbi, has that focused the minds amongst the finance ministries to get banking union done, to get credit markets? Do you see more momentum because of the threat posed by Beijing and, to a certain extent, Washington?
No, certainly during the Trump administration that definitely added to the impetus. Yeah. Of course, economists, as I already said, were always convinced that banking union, capital markets union would be good for the single market. We don't have a single market in banking services at the moment. We have no European capital market. It's fragmented. And if we make progress there, it will really help our potential growth rate. But then, as a side effect, it will also help, I think, on the international role.
Let me talk again about this issue of the euro as, I don't want to say a counterweight to the dollar, but as an alternative to the dollar. Again, from a geopolitical perspective, the countries that are that became, I guess, most angry about the way Trump dealt with the dollar as a weapon were countries, let's be honest, that I'm not sure Europe necessarily wants to be allied to, right? The Russians were very angry about this. The Chinese were very angry about this. Is there a danger that the euro, as positioning itself as an alternative to the dollar, gets itself slightly sideways geopolitically because it seems to be allying itself with Moscow, with Beijing, against the dollar? Is that a risk?
I don't think so, because with the Biden administration, Europe and the US have become closer again, which doesn't mean that we agree on everything. That was never the case looking back over the last decades. So we will continue to not accept extraterritorial sanctions. But we are again on speaking terms, so one can find common solutions. I don't think this particular problem means that Europe is drifting to Russia or China. On that particular point, we may have a common interest, but there are many other areas where the interest with the U.S. Economy and the U.S. people, American people, is much, much stronger.
Let me ask, though, as the euro, as you say, has gained a foothold as a alternative or a secondary reserve currency, there does come some geopolitical, what's the word I'm looking for? Responsibility, I guess.
Responsibilities, yeah.
To what extent do you think that the institutions of the euro started thinking about the euro in that regard? Does there need to be, I don't want to recommend another institution, but does there need to be a more thinking about the responsibility that comes along with being a reserve currency?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's correct. But this is also being discussed. And we saw it during this crisis that was triggered by the pandemic, by COVID-19, that some of that is already happening. For instance, the European Central Bank created many more swap arrangements with other European countries than they had done in earlier episodes of crisis. And that's one of the responsibilities of a reserve currency, to help other countries to get through it, because out of self-interest, the Federal Reserve, they also do it to help other countries, because that helps the world economy. And if it helps the world economy, it will also help the US economy. So I think that is indeed one of the responsibilities one has to then accept. But I think Europe is prepared for that.
Let me ask you sort of a touchy-feely question, which I normally don't do, but try to look 5-10 years down the road. Hopefully you and I will no longer be in these current jobs, we'll be doing something more interesting. But if we were to come back here at Delphi in 5-10 years, and the hope that you have for the euro to become either an alternate or a primary reserve currency is realized, what do you see the role of the euro there? Is it, obviously things like oil are now priced in dollars. Would you like to see oil priced in euros? I mean, what does the world look like in which the euro is actually on par with the dollar as a reserve currency?
Yeah. So first, to get it right, it will not be the primary currency. I don't expect that, not even in 20 or 30 years. So what I see is that there might be the three currencies, dollar, euro, renminbi, of relatively equal importance. And when you look at the economic weight, GDP, trade, that's already there now. Depending how you calculate the GDP weights, if it's at purchasing power parities, China is already clearly number one, and US and Europe are about the same level. Trade, Europe is ahead, the EU. There's more trade coming out and going into Europe than the others. So these are the three prime candidates, but of equal importance, so not one replacing the other. And it is a slow process. In world history, economic history, moving from one dominant currency to another always took several decades. When the dollar replaced the British pound, that took several decades. Before at one point the US dollar, the British pound replaced the Dutch guilder. This takes time, and for very good reasons, because the institutional inertia and the markets is very pronounced. But what will happen, I think indeed there could be more denomination in euro of certain commodity prices, including oil. And already today we have, outside the euro area, which comprises 19 countries, we have 50 other countries around the world that have in one way or another a link with the euro. Some, like Denmark, is in the EU and has a currency board almost with the euro, but they are not part of the euro area. Bulgaria, Croatia will probably enter the euro area, so it will continue to grow. But at the moment, they have a pretty fixed exchange rate. And there are many other examples of that. So that's another way. And then the question is whether other countries around the world will denominate some of their bond issues in euro. China started doing that, for instance, 2 years ago. They issued their first sovereign bond in euro. And that's what I mentioned in the very beginning. I think if more emerging markets can rely on, let's say, three currencies, and I'm not excluding there might be a fourth one day from Brazil, for instance, or India, if they get out of the pandemic and develop their economy well, but it's mainly three, could be 4 or 5. If then emerging markets have an opportunity to use these currencies to for their borrowing, for their investment, so reducing the reliance on one currency, then they are not hit so much if something happens in the US. If now the US raises or even talks about raising interest rates, tapering, we know there's an immediate impact on many emerging markets. If they relied more on several currencies, that would not be the case.
I got a whisper in my ear that we need to wrap it up, but just one last question on this. John Connolly, who was Treasury Secretary under Richard Nixon, once said famously, the dollar is our currency, but their problem, referring to Europe. Your mention of the pound made me think that the reserve currency does come along with the issue of Britain decline and America rise. The suggestion the euro may in some ways be an alternate does suggest at some point the US relatively is in decline. I'm curious, as you approach the Americans with these kinds of ideas, now that we're back in peaceful terms with the Biden administration, what kind of reaction do you get out of Washington when you suggest that perhaps the euro can play a role? You spent many years at the IMF in Washington, so you know Washington quite well.
I think they also know the numbers, but and the US administration before Trump, and I assume it's the same now, was always in favor of developing the euro, make the euro a strong currency that plays an important role in the world economy. That Chinese is coming up is not, from an economic perspective, not bad for anybody else. It means the relative weights are shifting, but it does not at all mean that in Europe or the US our standard of living is declining. It's just that they are growing faster in China than the US or Europe will be able to grow, because even after 40 years of strong growth in China, their GDP per capita, their standard of living, is still only 1/3 of Europe's average. So they have a long way to go in catching up, and during this catching up process, necessarily their growth rates will be higher than ours, and therefore their relative weight will continue to grow, and that will also have an impact on their currency.
So obviously Barack Obama, Tim Geithner played a key role in helping on the Eurozone crisis, as you say, supporting the euro and its continuation, but no pushback on this issue of reserve currency, alternate currency, when you raise this issue in Washington at all?
No, not really, but maybe in those days before Trump we didn't talk so clearly about it. It has moved to the top of the agenda of policy making in Europe only the last 2 years. Partly triggered by Trump, and partly because we see what's happening in the world around us. And definitely Europe wants to maintain a good, strong place between these two superpowers, which are there and they will continue to be superpowers. But we think the European Union, Europe, must play a role in that and be as sovereign as possible.
Time is up. Klaus Regling, always good to share the stage with you, and perhaps we'll be back here in 10 years to find out whether your predictions are right.
We will check it out.
Thank you very much. Back to the studio.